Hello and welcome back to the High Speed Snail channel. This video is the second of two parts relating information regarding the Hinckley Fire. If you have not watched the first part yet, please do so before watching or listening to this one. Thank you. And now, we continue. The southbound Limited on the St. Paul and Duluth Road left Duluth at about 2 p.m. on the afternoon of that eventful Saturday. The train was in charge of conductor Thomas Sullivan, engineer James Root, fireman Jack McGowan, brakeman John Monahan, baggageman George F. Morris, Porter John W. Blair, and news agent Herman Manhart. The train consisted of one combination car, one coach, two chair cars, and engine 69. The atmosphere was heavy with smoke even as the train pulled out of the Duluth depot, and all the way down to Carleton it grew gradually thicker, until it was found necessary to light the headlamp and all the lamps in the train. The passengers began to show signs of uneasiness. Onward swept the ill-fated train with its cargo of humanity, and, but for the heroism of two men, it might have been to certain destruction. But James Root and John McGowan were made of sterner stuff than the ordinary mortal, and when the terrible ordeal came, they were not found wanting. Root, with many others, was under a false impression as to the actual extent and intensity of the fire, and never dreamed that Hinckley would be destroyed in this way. Still, the smoke increased, the heat became more intense. It filled all the coaches until it was difficult to breathe, and of course added to the dismay of the already panicky passengers. The trainmen tried to reassure the passengers, but by this time the train had approached near enough so that the flames could be seen to the right of the track, and the roar of the blazing demon could be distinctly heard. At its height, it could be heard at Pine City, 15 miles away. On rumbled the train, every instant adding to the terror of the scene, until within a mile and a half of Hinckley. Here came the first information that anything extraordinary had happened or was happening in the town. The smoke was so dense it was impossible to see in it. A number of fleeing citizens flagged the train, and in a few words told the crew their story, then with their party boarded the train. About 150 or 200 people were all saved in this way. They boarded the train, a gasping, excited, half-crazed concourse. The fire was coming with the speed of a locomotive, backed by that terrible wind. Engineer Root's first impulse was to put on all speed and run through the fire, but a second of deliberation caused him to reverse his engine and back away from it. Then came a race which had no parallel. No one can have any conception of the awfulness, the suffering of that terrible ride. At first, Root had no definite destination in mind, and no orders to run on but those of common sense and humanity. Then he thought of a little marsh known as Skunk Lake, near the track about 4 miles from where they had met the refugees and turned back. This he determined to reach at all hazards. On came the flames, and he saw that they were gaining on him, gaining until they burst over him in a hurricane blast. The flame and smoke were everywhere. They came in through the ventilators at the tops of the cars, through the cracks at the sides of the windows. The rear coach was on fire, and his passengers fled into other coaches to escape from the immediate danger, but the effort was futile. One after another, all the coaches first blistered with the heat, and finally began to blaze. Then ensued a scene horrible beyond description. The roar of the flames, the stifling suffocation and darkness of the smoke, the intense heat, the shrieks and moans of the unfortunate almost baking in the crowded cars, made it a pandemonium. The heat broke the glass in the windows of the cars, and as it did so, one man lost his reason, literally went mad, and with a shriek threw himself through one of the windows and was swallowed up in the seething mass. Another and another followed him, and all were caught and destroyed by the insatiable flames. In the panic that ensued, 10 more unfortunates thought death itself preferable to such suspense and torture, and threw themselves from the windows of the doomed train. While all these scenes were being enacted in the coaches, Engineer Root was suffering terrible agony. His hands were blistered as he held the lever. His clothes were afire, and as were those of Fireman McGowan. Jack leaped into the manhole of the tank and put out the fire in his own clothes, then, grasping a pail, soused Jim with the water from the tank. Still, on they flew, Jim holding onto the lever, and Jack dashing in water over him. The glass in the cab window at Jim's side burst, and a piece struck him in the neck, cutting a gash which bled profusely. When the window broke, the curtain caught fire. The flames swept into the cab, burning the wooden handles of the steam connections, scorching the seats, and melting the cab lamp. Weakened by heat and smoke, the loss of blood, and the tension, Root was twice overcome and he fell from his seat, and twice was bolstered up by the faithful Jack. Minutes they were, but they seemed like hours before Skunk Lake was reached. The engineer brought his train to a standstill, and the fireman pointed out to the passengers the direction of the lake. McGowan assisted his engineer to the water, lay down in it himself. Owing to his superior physical strength, he was able to care for Root and others until the arrival of the relief trains came from Duluth. Manhart, the news agent, and John Blair, the colored porter, did much to save women and children. While practically everyone was prostrate in the water, Blair stood sprinkling the women with a fire extinguisher. The train had on board from 130 to 150 regular passengers and took aboard from 150 to 200 refugees from Hinckley. The exact number will never be known. Certain it is that more than 300 people owe their lives to that little water that remained in the lake, which, owing to the continued drought, had been reduced to a mere morass of mud and water. Here they lay for 4 mortal hours, their faces close to the muddy water, endeavoring to survive the heat and smoke which lay so close to the ground that they were in danger of suffocation. Most of the passengers reached the lake, except some few who became confused and ran wildly in the other direction. The only fatalities occurring on the train itself were 2 Chinese who seemed dazed or demented and could not be moved from their seats. They stayed there until overcome by the heat and burned with the train, which was entirely consumed. Then, too, were those who threw themselves from the train before it reached Skunk Lake, all of whom perished. Conductor Sullivan, as soon as he saw his passengers safe, started staggering back along the track to the next station to protect his train, as he knew he was running on the time of a freight train that was following, and feared that calamity of a collision would add to what was already occurred. After a terrible ordeal of battling through heat and smoke, he reached Miller's station and sent his message. Then, having fulfilled his trust, he collapsed. After the fire had abated somewhat, Ritt and McGowan went back to see if they could not save their engine and tender. Finding it impossible to distinguish their burning coal and tender, they uncoupled the engine from it and ran her ahead a short distance. This saved most of the engine. Ritt had by this time become thoroughly chilled from lying in the water, and he lay on the floor of his cab where he was found by the First Relief, which, by the way, consisted of some heroic section men and handcars. 2 more heroic railroad men are yet unmentioned. Tom Dunn, a telegraph operator at the St. Paul and Duluth station at Hinckley, stayed at his post to direct the movement of trains until it was too late to save himself. Another was a section man named Henley, who, in the semi-darkness of smoke and heat, with falling embers burning holes in his clothing, stood in a street directing terrified, fleeing citizens to the safety of the shallow water of the gravel pit. 70 lives were saved in that pool, including that of brave Henley himself, who sought his refuge only at the last moment. Here and there, creeping spots of fire continued to burn on for 5 days after the destruction of Hinckley, being finally checked by rain, which began falling on September 7th. The total number of deaths caused by the fire will never be definitely known. For months afterwards, lumbermen and hunters were finding scattered bodies of unfortunates who had been overtaken by the galloping flames and perished, leaving no trace of their identity. These included 22 identified as Indians. So far as known, the total number of lives lost is 476. Later, the estimate was placed at more than 500. Well, that ends the book portion, but it's not the end of the story. Later on, after the turn of the century, the death toll was fixed at, quote, 418 known and perhaps a dozen more suspected, unquote. However, that number and the fact that between 200,000 and 250,000 acres of timber had been consumed places fire as the 3rd largest the nation had ever seen. But also that was not the end of the town of Hinckley. We'll get to that in a moment. However, before the tremendous task of rebuilding commenced, the main task at hand was burial of the dead. Dozens. Though the death toll was hundreds, there were a few mass burial trenches that were dug, as had been mentioned in the book. Bodies continued to be found for years, even up to a decade afterwards. Since whole families had been lost, relatives had to come from afar to identify who was who, because some of the farming families were new to the area, and those that were working in the timberlands, sometimes those folks traveled and weren't from those parts. So even as people were being buried, bodies were still occasionally being identified before being covered over by the earth. On the better side of things, the American Red Cross, started by Clara Barton after the Civil War, and whose first large disaster was that of the Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania in 1889, a mere 5 years before, was on the scene within a week. The Red Cross and other organizations of compassion started providing services and relief to the people affected, and that remained. Food, drinking water, goods, shelter. The U.S. Army provided tents. The Red Cross had erected dormitories in which single men could stay in bunk-style accommodations. The railroads quickly moved in temporary depots, basically retrofitted railroad cars. Boxcars are sometimes disused passenger stock. That became the place to purchase tickets and where the freight was handled in the open, and what freight there was. Donations from all across the United States poured into the town of Hinckley and the nearby villages affected. The sawmill never reopened, as the trees for miles around were gone, but instead a land office opened to sell off the former timberlands, and a settlement boom occurred agriculturally, along with all sorts of materials ordered and donated from elsewhere being shipped in. Lumber, nails, paint, cook stoves, furniture, clothing, shoes, dishes, tableware, lamps, lanterns, horse harnesses, and even horses and cattle were donated from other parts of the country for the relief of the burned-out citizens of the fire zone, or were purchased on contract from afar to be resold locally. The lumberyard opened a hut before the remains of the old sawmill had even stopped smoldering and had timber for sale on order. Naturally, the telegraph lines were restrung for the railroads within a day or two, and communication with the outside world resumed, allowing them to both hear about the tragedy and for the remaining people to start rebuilding their business lives. The St. Paul and Duluth, which became Northern Pacific in 1900, built a new depot in 1895, complete with a large detached freight house, a beanery, which would be the food service, separate men's and women's waiting rooms, and agents' quarters above the depot proper. Steam locomotives no longer thunder through the town of Hinckley. Trains don't even stop there anymore. Haven't since the 1960s. The town has grown larger and more to the east towards the interstate highway there, and forest fires of large proportions are a distant memory for that part of the nation. But even so, there's reminders here and there of the fire of September 1894, and the heroic actions of the men who did their best to save what they could from the flames. In 1900, the townsfolk erected a monument in memoriam of the hundreds that had died during the fire 6 years previous. It still stands atop the trench of graves of the dead, located off the modern State Highway 48. A similar but smaller memorial is placed in the cemetery at Brook Park, near where the fire began. The St. Paul and Duluth Depot is still standing and as the home of the Hinckley Fire Museum, and is open to the public from March through October, with many exhibits about the fire itself and reconstruction furniture in the agents' quarters rooms displays. Through a grant, they're also able to replicate a small relief house, so people can see how the residents of Hinckley lived immediately after the fire. Naturally, there are other little signs of what once was, here and there in the nearby vicinity, if one chooses to look carefully and closely. So, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this slightly different type of production. The images displayed were garnered from a number of sources, including those of the Minnesota State Archives, the Hinckley Fire Museum, and other places, all of which are in the public domain. If you did enjoy this video, please like, share, and subscribe to aid this channel's growth. And if you have some spare change, I'd very much appreciate it, as donations are what helps me to spend more time on this channel to develop more videos and content for you to enjoy. Links are in the description. Thanks again for watching and listening, and have a good day, folks.